The most dangerous room in a billion-dollar company is usually the one everyone thinks is symbolic. At 8:17 a.m. on a gray Tuesday morning, the 49th floor of Caldwell Dynamics overlooked Midtown Manhattan through walls of glass that stretched from polished stone floors to a ceiling lined with recessed lighting. Below, traffic flowed along Lexington Avenue in orderly streams of yellow taxis, black SUVs, and delivery trucks navigating the city with mechanical precision. Inside the executive level, everything appeared flawless. The air carried the faint scent of espresso, leather, and expensive ambition. Screens glowed across trading terminals. Assistants moved quietly through corridors lined with framed acquisitions worth billions. Investors from Boston, Chicago, and San Francisco gathered near the boardroom waiting for the quarterly leadership announcement. Ethan Caldwell stood at the center of it all. At 48 years old, he had become one of the most recognizable names in American technology. Financial magazines called him a visionary. Business networks called him a builder. Employees called him sir before he entered a room. He wore a tailored charcoal suit that seemed designed specifically for television interviews, and his smile carried the easy confidence of a man who had spent years believing success was permanent. Near him stood Madison Blake. Her blonde hair fell neatly across the shoulders of a cream-colored designer jacket, and a polished executive badge hung from a silver lanyard around her neck. She smiled often, spoke confidently, and had recently become a familiar face at company events. Most employees understood exactly why. Several board members exchanged brief glances when they saw her standing beside Ethan that morning, but no one said anything. Power often teaches people which truths remain unspoken. At the far end of the executive floor sat a corner office wrapped in glass. The room occupied nearly 2,000 square feet and overlooked both the East River and the Manhattan skyline. Visitors often assumed it belonged to Ethan. It did not. The office belonged to Naomi Carter. Her name appeared discreetly on a brushed steel plaque beside the door. Unlike Ethan, Naomi rarely appeared in interviews. She never attended media tours. She never accepted awards. Most investors knew her only as Ethan's wife and an occasional presence at charity galas. What they did not know was that nearly every operational system inside Caldwell Dynamics traced back to decisions she had made years earlier. She understood the architecture of the company the way an engineer understands the foundation of a bridge. Quietly, completely. Yet that morning, her office door stood open. Employees moving through the corridor slowed when they noticed maintenance staff carrying boxes through the entrance. Framed certifications disappeared from the walls. Personal books were removed from shelves. Family photographs vanished into storage containers. One assistant stopped walking altogether when she saw workers disconnecting equipment from Naomi's executive workstation. Another quickly lowered his eyes and continued toward the elevators. Nobody asked questions. Nobody needed to. Rumors had been moving through the building for weeks. At exactly 8:29 a.m., Ethan stepped onto a small presentation platform near the boardroom entrance. Conversations stopped. Coffee cups lowered. Investors turned toward him. Madison stood nearby, smiling. Ethan welcomed everyone, thanked the leadership team, and spoke about growth projections, innovation initiatives, and market expansion opportunities. Then he made the announcement. Beginning immediately, Madison Blake would be moving into the Executive Operations Office to support a broader strategic leadership role. Applause followed, some of it genuine, most of it cautious. Madison thanked Ethan and accepted congratulations as cameras captured the moment. Through the glass wall behind them, employees could see movers carrying the final boxes from Naomi's office. The symbolism was impossible to miss. Ethan looked pleased. Madison looked victorious. Neither noticed the woman standing quietly near the private elevator at the opposite end of the floor. Naomi Carter wore a dark burgundy suit and carried a slim black portfolio beneath one arm. She watched the announcement without visible emotion. No anger, no embarrassment, no public reaction. Her calmness unsettled the few employees who noticed her presence. Because people who truly understand power rarely waste energy defending it. They simply wait. As applause continued across the executive floor, Naomi walked toward her office one final time. Inside, nearly everything had been removed. The shelves were empty. The desk had been cleared. The room felt unfamiliar for the first time in 12 years. Yet her attention moved immediately toward a narrow drawer built into a side cabinet beneath the windows. She opened it carefully. Inside rested a small black access key, no larger than a house key. No branding, no label, no indication of importance. Naomi studied it for several seconds before slipping it into her portfolio. Then she looked around the empty office one last time. Outside the glass walls, Madison was already giving instructions to assistants as if the room had always belonged to her. Ethan stood nearby speaking with investors. Everyone seemed satisfied. Everyone seemed confident. Everyone seemed convinced they understood exactly what had happened. They were wrong. Because the office Ethan had just handed to his mistress was never valuable because of the view. It was valuable because of what the room controlled. And within a matter of hours, the entire company would begin discovering the difference. At 9:12 a.m., the executive floor looked exactly the way Ethan Caldwell wanted it to look. Investors moved confidently between conference rooms. Senior executives reviewed quarterly projections displayed across massive wall screens. Assistants delivered fresh coffee from silver service carts while sunlight reflected against the surrounding glass towers of Manhattan. Success had a particular appearance, and Caldwell Dynamics had perfected it. Madison Blake stood inside her new office near the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the East River. She turned slowly, admiring the space that had become the most visible symbol of influence inside the company. The room was larger than many apartments in the city. A polished walnut desk occupied the center. Digital displays lined one wall. Original artwork hung beneath carefully placed lighting. Every detail communicated authority. Madison smiled as two assistants finished arranging her personal items. A framed photograph was placed beside the desk. A designer notebook rested near the keyboard. Fresh white orchids arrived from a florist on Fifth Avenue. Everything felt permanent. Across the floor, Ethan watched through the glass and felt satisfied. The transition had gone smoothly. No public objections. No confrontation. No scenes. Naomi had simply left. That was what convinced him he had won. People often mistake silence for surrender. At 9:27 a.m., the first executive meeting began. 12 senior leaders gathered around a conference table overlooking Midtown. Revenue forecasts appeared on interactive screens. Market expansion plans filled presentation decks. Ethan led the discussion with the confidence of a man who believed the future remained entirely under his control. Madison attended beside him, taking notes and occasionally offering suggestions. Several executives nodded politely. Others exchanged cautious glances when Ethan repeatedly referred to Madison as a critical part of the company's future. Nobody challenged him. Power creates agreement even when belief is absent. Meanwhile, 23 floors below, Naomi entered a private elevator reserved for infrastructure leadership. Most employees never used it. Most did not even know it existed. The elevator descended quietly through secured levels until it reached a restricted floor with no public signage. The doors opened onto a corridor lined with frosted glass and secure access points. The atmosphere felt different there. Less glamorous. More important, the people working on that level were engineers, architects, and systems specialists responsible for keeping billions of dollars in daily operations functioning without interruption. Several employees looked up as Naomi entered. No one appeared surprised to see her. In fact, their expressions suggested they had expected her arrival. Marcus Reed stood near a secured entrance holding a tablet. At 6 feet 3 inches tall with silver at his temples and 20 years of experience in enterprise systems, Marcus rarely displayed emotion. Yet even he seemed uneasy. "They completed the transfer this morning," he said quietly. Naomi nodded. "I know." Marcus hesitated before continuing. "They also reassigned the executive authentication suite." Naomi stopped walking. For the first time all morning, her attention sharpened. "Officially," she asked. Marcus handed her the tablet. A digital authorization form appeared on the screen. Ethan's approval sat beneath the request. Madison's name appeared beside the newly assigned credentials. Naomi read the document once. Then she read it again. The corridor remained silent. Several engineers pretended to focus on nearby monitors while carefully listening. Finally, Naomi returned the tablet. Was legal consulted? Marcus shook his head. No. That answer seemed to confirm something she already suspected. Neither of them spoke for several seconds. Beyond the glass walls, rows of servers processed transactions, client records, security protocols, and operational data for hundreds of corporate partners across the country. Every second, millions of dollars move through systems most executives never fully understood. Ethan viewed those systems as infrastructure. Naomi viewed them as architecture. There was a difference. At 10:04 a.m., back on the executive floor, Madison sat behind her new desk preparing for a media interview scheduled later that afternoon. She opened drawers, reviewed files, and explored features built into the office. Most appeared ordinary. Then she noticed a secure compartment integrated into the side cabinet. Curious, she attempted to open it. The compartment remained locked. She tried again. Nothing happened. Slightly annoyed, she contacted facilities. 10 minutes later, a technician arrived. He examined the compartment and frowned. "I have never seen this lock before," he admitted. Madison laughed lightly and instructed him to remove it. The technician hesitated. Then, under pressure, he connected a diagnostic tool to the mechanism. Across the city, on a secured monitoring screen hidden 3 floors below street level, a single notification quietly appeared. Unauthorized access attempt detected. System verification pending. And for the first time that morning, a small yellow status indicator changed color. At 10:17 a.m., nobody on the executive floor noticed the change. The quarterly meetings continued. Investors reviewed forecasts. Analysts discussed expansion into European markets. Assistants moved through corridors carrying tablets and coffee trays. From the outside, Caldwell Dynamics looked exactly the way a $12 billion company was supposed to look. Yet 3 floors below street level, a yellow indicator continued blinking quietly on a secured monitoring screen. Marcus Reed watched it from the Infrastructure Operations Center. The room was dimly lit, lined with curved displays showing live system activity from hundreds of locations across the country. Most alerts disappeared within seconds. This one did not. Naomi stood beside him with her portfolio resting against the edge of a workstation. She remained calm as engineers monitored the status update. One young systems analyst glanced toward her. "The verification process is still running," he said. Naomi nodded once. "How long?" "Normally less than 30 seconds. Marcus looked at the clock mounted above the main display. More than 12 minutes had already passed. That answer seemed to concern him more than anyone else. Across the room, another engineer pulled up archived records linked to the executive authentication suite. Lines of encrypted authorization data appeared across multiple screens. Most employees would not have understood what they were seeing. Naomi did. Every system has a memory. Every architecture remembers who built it. At 10:31 a.m., Madison Blake completed her media interview inside the executive office. She spoke confidently about leadership, innovation, and the company's future. Cameras captured the Manhattan skyline behind her while reporters nodded politely. Everything appeared perfect. After the interview ended, she returned to the secure compartment that remained locked inside the cabinet. The facilities technician was still working beside it. His expression had become noticeably less comfortable. "Any progress?" Madison asked. The technician shook his head. "This is not connected to building security." "Then what is it connected to?" He hesitated. "I'm not sure." Madison crossed her arms. "Open it." The technician connected a second diagnostic device. Moments later, the compartment emitted a soft electronic tone. The lock disengaged. Madison smiled. Finally, inside rested a black folder and a brushed steel key holder containing no key. The compartment appeared almost empty. Her disappointment was immediate. She expected something valuable. Confidential files, corporate secrets, executive privileges. Instead, she found paperwork. She opened the folder. Most of the pages contained technical diagrams she did not understand. System maps, security architecture, operational structures. Hundreds of pages documenting infrastructure built years earlier. Madison flipped through them with growing impatience. None of it seemed important. Then she reached a page near the center. Across the top appeared a title, Foundational Infrastructure Stewardship Agreement. Beneath it sat a signature, Naomi Carter. Madison frowned. She did not recognize the significance. She closed the folder and tossed it onto the desk. Outside the office, Ethan arrived carrying another group of investors. He appeared pleased with the morning's events. Madison quickly stood and greeted him. "You should have seen the interview," she said. Ethan laughed. "I am sure it was excellent." He glanced around the office. Everything settled? Almost. She pointed toward the open compartment. There was some strange locked cabinet. Ethan barely looked. Old infrastructure paperwork, probably. Then he dismissed the subject entirely. Success often creates a dangerous habit. People stop investigating things they believe they already understand. At 10:44 a.m., 2,000 miles away in Phoenix, Arizona, a regional operations manager attempted to access a secured reporting dashboard. The system rejected his credentials. Assuming it was a temporary glitch, he tried again. Same result. A minute later, a logistics supervisor in Dallas experienced a similar problem. Then a compliance analyst in Seattle. Individually, none of the incidents seemed serious. Technology companies encounter minor issues every day. Nobody connected them. Yet inside the operations center beneath Manhattan, engineers began noticing a pattern. One screen changed from green to amber. Then another. Marcus stepped closer to a display showing authentication pathways across the enterprise network. Several nodes were no longer responding normally. Not failing. Not crashing. Simply refusing to recognize recently modified executive credentials. Marcus looked toward Naomi. It is spreading. She studied the display carefully. Her expression remained unreadable. No, she said quietly. It is verifying. The difference mattered. At 10:52 a.m., a new notification appeared across the monitoring system. The room fell silent. Engineers stopped typing. Analysts turned toward the main display. Even Marcus seemed surprised. The message consisted of only 6 words. Steward verification sequence initiated. Beneath the notification, a countdown clock appeared. 24 hours, 59 minutes, 51 seconds. And it was still running. At 11:03 a.m., the countdown continued moving across the monitoring display with quiet indifference. 24 hours had become 24 hours minus 11 minutes. No alarms sounded. No emergency notifications appeared. Nothing dramatic happened. That was what made the situation unsettling. Real infrastructure rarely announced itself. It simply continued enforcing rules that most people never knew existed. Marcus Reed stood with both hands resting against the operations console while analysts reviewed system activity flowing through hundreds of enterprise channels. The amber indicators had increased from 2 to 7. Not enough to create concern on the executive floor. More than enough to attract attention from engineers who understood what they were seeing. One analyst rotated her chair toward Marcus. The authentication conflicts are spreading into regional networks. Marcus nodded slowly. How many? 17 locations so far. Another engineer looked up from his workstation. And all of them are connected to recently reassigned executive permissions. The room grew quiet again. Naomi remained near the back wall, watching data move across the screens. She did not appear surprised. She looked like someone observing a process she already understood. Above them, 49 floors higher, Ethan Caldwell entered another boardroom presentation. The room overlooked Midtown Manhattan through glass walls that reflected the late morning sunlight across polished surfaces and expensive confidence. Board members reviewed growth projections while investment bankers discussed acquisition opportunities. Ethan spoke comfortably about expansion strategies and future valuations. The company remained profitable. The stock remained stable. The press coverage remained positive. From his perspective, everything was proceeding exactly as planned. Madison sat beside him, occasionally contributing comments that earned polite approval from several attendees. She felt increasingly comfortable occupying the space Naomi had once held. Power, she believed, was becoming visible. During a short break, one of the board members approached Ethan privately. Richard Holloway had served on the board for nearly 15 years and had survived enough corporate cycles to recognize when something felt unusual. Quick question, Richard said. Ethan looked up from his tablet. Of course. Richard lowered his voice slightly. Why was the executive authentication suite reassigned? Ethan seemed amused. Administrative restructuring. Richard studied him carefully. Without infrastructure review? Ethan smiled. It was an office transfer, Richard. Not a merger. Richard nodded, though his expression suggested he was unconvinced. Experience teaches caution. Success often teaches the opposite. Meanwhile, Madison returned to the executive office carrying a fresh set of briefing documents. The black folder she had discovered earlier remained on the desk where she had left it. Curious, she opened it again. This time she paid closer attention to the contents. Several pages contained diagrams connecting operational systems, executive permissions, and infrastructure oversight mechanisms. Most of it still seemed excessively technical. Then she noticed something unusual. Nearly every document referenced a single designation: steward authority. The term appeared repeatedly throughout the folder. Steward verification, steward authorization, steward continuity protocols. Madison frowned. The language sounded important, yet she had never heard anyone mention it. She picked up her phone and called Ethan. "Have you ever heard of something called steward authority?" There was a brief pause. "No. It is all over these documents." Ethan laughed softly. "Then it is probably obsolete." Madison accepted the answer immediately. Neither of them realized that some systems remain invisible precisely because they continue working. At 11:26 a.m., a notification reached Marcus Reed's terminal. He opened it and exhaled slowly. Another authentication pathway had entered verification status. Then another. Then a third. The sequence was accelerating. One analyst turned toward Naomi. "The system is identifying every executive change made during the transition." Naomi nodded. "It always does." The analyst hesitated. "Then why did nobody know?" Naomi looked toward the enormous display wall where network architecture stretched across dozens of interconnected systems. "Because most people only pay attention to things that create headlines." Marcus glanced at the countdown clock. 23 hours and 33 minutes remained. He understood something the executive floor did not. The process had already moved beyond human decisions. It was no longer asking for approval. It was following instructions written years earlier. Outside the operations center, Manhattan continued moving beneath a bright autumn sky. Markets opened. Meetings continued. Contracts were signed. Elevators carried executives through towers of glass and steel. Yet deep inside the infrastructure that powered Caldwell Dynamics, old rules had awakened. And for the first time, the architecture Naomi built was beginning to examine who actually belonged inside it. At 11:48 a.m., the first visible crack appeared where nobody expected it. A senior compliance director in Atlanta attempted to approve a regulatory filing scheduled for release before market close. The system rejected her credentials. She tried again. Same result. Assuming it was a routine software issue, she contacted support. 10 minutes later, support discovered similar reports arriving from Denver, Houston, Miami, and Portland. None of the failures were catastrophic. None stopped operations completely. Yet each one involved permissions connected to recent executive authorization changes. Inside the operations center beneath Manhattan, the pattern became impossible to ignore. Amber indicators now stretched across multiple regions on the infrastructure map. Marcus Reed watched the display while analysts exchanged increasingly concerned looks. The countdown clock continued its steady progression. 23 hours and 11 minutes remained. One engineer adjusted his glasses and reviewed a diagnostic report. "The system is isolating authorization pathways." Another analyst turned toward him. "Can we override it?" The engineer shook his head. "There is no override option available." Marcus already knew why. Years earlier, Naomi had designed the architecture to operate independently when stewardship verification activated. The entire purpose was to prevent influence from interfering with infrastructure integrity. At the time, several consultants argued the protection was excessive. Naomi disagreed. Systems worth billions could not rely on assumptions. They had to rely on rules. Across the city, Ethan Caldwell remained unaware of the growing complexity beneath his company. He had moved into a private dining room overlooking Bryant Park with a group of institutional investors managing billions in pension and retirement assets. White tablecloths, polished silver, and floor-to-ceiling windows framed the lunch meeting. Ethan spoke confidently about expansion targets and future earnings. Investors listened carefully. Madison sat nearby, enjoying the attention that increasingly followed her wherever she went. She had already received 3 interview requests and 2 invitations to leadership events scheduled later in the year. The transition appeared complete. Success felt close enough to touch. During dessert, Ethan's phone vibrated. He glanced at the screen. The message came from the Chief Information Officer. "Minor authentication irregularities. Monitoring. No action required." Ethan barely read the second sentence. He locked the screen and returned to the conversation. One investor asked about operational resilience. Ethan smiled. Our infrastructure is among the strongest in the industry. The statement was technically true. He simply misunderstood who had made it that way. Back at headquarters, Madison returned to the executive office and noticed something unusual. The large digital display integrated into the wall behind the desk had gone dark. Not completely offline, just inactive. She touched the control panel. Nothing happened. She contacted facilities again. A technician arrived within minutes and examined the system. That is strange, he admitted. The display is receiving power. Madison crossed her arms impatiently. Then why is it not working? The technician hesitated. It looks like access permissions were removed. Madison frowned. By who? The technician could not answer. Because the system itself had executed the change. Several floors below, Naomi sat quietly in a conference room connected to the operations center. A wall of glass overlooked rows of engineers monitoring enterprise activity. Sunlight filtered through narrow windows positioned near street level. The room felt calm despite the growing tension outside it. Marcus entered carrying a printed report. We found something. Naomi accepted the document. The report listed every system event triggered since the executive office transfer. Hundreds of automated reviews had activated throughout the network. Most had already completed. A few remained active. One line near the center of the report caught Marcus's attention. Executive occupancy validation sequence. He looked toward Naomi. I have never seen that process before. Naomi studied the page briefly. Because it has never been needed before. Marcus sat across from her. What happens when it finishes? For the first time all day, Naomi allowed herself a faint smile. Not satisfaction. Not revenge. Recognition. The kind that comes when a design performs exactly as intended. Outside, Manhattan remained bright beneath a clear autumn sky. Markets traded. Meetings continued. Contracts moved through approval channels. Yet beneath the polished surface of Caldwell Dynamics, invisible mechanisms continued evaluating every recent decision. And with each passing minute, the architecture Ethan believed belonged to him was quietly deciding whether it agreed. At 12:34 p.m., the atmosphere inside Caldwell Dynamics began changing in ways that executives could feel but could not yet explain. Nothing dramatic had happened. The stock price remained stable. Revenue systems continued processing transactions. Clients remained unaware of any issues. Yet an unusual tension moved through the building like a shift in air pressure before a storm. Employees who normally worked with effortless confidence were making more phone calls than usual. Managers were requesting status updates. Technology teams were quietly assembling conference calls across multiple time zones. The company was still functioning. It simply no longer felt predictable. On the 49th floor, Ethan Caldwell stepped out of a strategy meeting and immediately noticed 3 missed calls from senior operations leaders. Mild irritation crossed his face. He returned the first call while walking toward the executive office. What is happening? He asked. The voice on the other end sounded cautious. Several regional divisions are reporting permission conflicts. Ethan sighed. Then fix them. We are trying. The response carried enough hesitation to capture his attention. Trying. Ethan stopped walking. What does that mean? A brief silence followed. It means the permissions are being modified by an active verification process we cannot interrupt. Ethan frowned. Who authorized it? The answer arrived immediately. We do not know. For the first time that day, Ethan felt something unfamiliar. Not fear. Not concern. Annoyance mixed with uncertainty. He ended the call and continued toward the office. Inside, Madison Blake was seated behind the desk reviewing media requests. The dark display screen behind her remained inactive despite repeated service attempts. 2 technicians stood nearby examining access logs. Neither looked confident. Madison glanced up. More problems. Ethan dismissed the question with a wave. Temporary technology issue. He wanted the explanation to be true. The technicians exchanged a look but remained silent. Several floors below street level, Naomi Carter sat alone in a private conference room overlooking the operations center. The black portfolio rested on the table beside her. Through the glass wall, she could see engineers moving between workstations as system reports continued arriving from around the country. Marcus Reed entered carrying another printed update. He closed the door behind him. The verification sequence expanded again. Naomi accepted the report. How many systems? 38. She reviewed the pages calmly. The list included logistics networks, compliance approvals, executive authentication pathways, and infrastructure oversight channels. None had failed completely. Each had simply entered review status. Marcus sat across from her. "I have spent 20 years building enterprise systems," he said quietly. "I have never seen architecture behave like this." Naomi placed the report on the table. "Because most architecture is designed to serve executives." Marcus waited. "And this one?" Naomi looked through the glass toward the operations floor. "This one was designed to protect the company." The distinction settled heavily between them. At 1:02 p.m., another notification appeared on the main monitoring wall. Several engineers immediately turned toward it. Marcus stood. Naomi remained seated. The message contained a new designation. Occupancy conflict confirmed. Steward review escalated. Across the room, conversations stopped. One analyst whispered, "What does that mean?" Marcus already knew enough to understand the implication. The system had reached a conclusion. It no longer considered the office transfer an administrative change. It considered it a governance event. Above them, Ethan entered the executive office and found Madison standing near the window overlooking Manhattan. She appeared frustrated. "The display still does not work," she said. Ethan barely listened. Another message had arrived from operations leadership requesting an emergency review meeting. The requests were becoming impossible to ignore. Madison walked toward him holding the black folder she had discovered earlier. Maybe this explains something. Ethan accepted the folder reluctantly. He flipped through several pages before stopping at a document near the center. His eyes narrowed slightly. Foundational Infrastructure Stewardship Agreement. The name beneath the document was impossible to miss. Naomi Carter. For several seconds, he stared at the signature. Then he turned another page. And another. The deeper he read, the less confident he looked. Outside the windows, sunlight reflected across the glass towers of Manhattan. Inside the office, a silence settled over the room. Because for the first time that day, Ethan was no longer asking what was happening. He was beginning to ask a far more dangerous question. What exactly had Naomi built without telling him? At 1:28 p.m., Ethan Caldwell remained standing beside the executive desk long after Madison stopped speaking. The folder felt heavier than paper should. Page after page described systems he recognized, infrastructure he funded, and networks he believed belonged to his company. Yet one detail appeared repeatedly throughout the documentation. Steward authority. The designation surfaced in governance diagrams, security frameworks, operational contingencies, and executive continuity procedures. Every path eventually pointed toward the same name. Naomi Carter. Madison watched him carefully. "What is it?" Ethan closed the folder. "Old infrastructure language." The answer sounded weaker than he intended. Madison sensed it immediately. "Then why do you look concerned?" Ethan did not respond. Because for the first time in years, he had encountered something inside his own company that he could not immediately explain. Outside the office, senior executives were beginning to ask questions of their own. Reports continued arriving from regional divisions. Approval pathways were slowing. Administrative permissions were being reviewed automatically. Several executive assistants discovered that access rights granted only hours earlier had already been suspended pending verification. No one understood why. More importantly, nobody knew who possessed authority to stop it. 3 floors below street level, Marcus Reed stood before the primary operations display, while dozens of engineers monitored the expanding review sequence. The countdown clock continued moving. 22 hours and 31 minutes remained. A new series of notifications appeared across the screen. Infrastructure lineage validation. Governance authentication review. Steward continuity assessment. One analyst stared at the messages. "It is checking everything." Marcus nodded. "That is exactly what it is doing." Naomi remained seated at the conference table overlooking the operations floor. She reviewed another report while sunlight filtered through narrow windows high on the wall. Her calmness had become increasingly noticeable to everyone around her. Engineers were nervous. Managers were confused. Yet Naomi appeared completely at ease. Not because she controlled the process, because she understood it. At 1:41 p.m., a black sedan stopped outside Caldwell Dynamics headquarters. A tall man stepped from the rear passenger door, carrying a dark leather briefcase. Charles Whitmore moved with the quiet confidence of someone accustomed to entering rooms where billions of dollars were discussed without raising his voice. As senior corporate counsel, he had spent decades protecting companies from external threats. Very few people realized he spent just as much time protecting them from internal mistakes. Security waved him through immediately. 20 minutes later, he entered the operations center. Several engineers recognized him and exchanged surprised looks. Legal counsel rarely visited infrastructure floors. Charles walked directly toward Naomi. "Good afternoon." Naomi stood and shook his hand. "You came quickly." Charles glanced toward the monitoring displays. "Your message suggested urgency." Marcus approached. Naomi introduced them. Charles opened his briefcase and removed a thick cream-colored document secured with a dark ribbon. The paper looked old, older than most of the systems currently running inside the company. Marcus studied it curiously. "What is that?" Charles placed the document on the conference table. "The original stewardship agreement." The room seemed to become quieter. Naomi opened the document carefully. Several signatures occupied the first page. Founders, investors, governance architects, infrastructure trustees. Names that helped build Caldwell Dynamics long before financial media began celebrating Ethan's success. Marcus leaned closer. "I did not know this existed." Charles adjusted his glasses. Most people did not. Naomi turned another page. The language was precise, deliberate, and impossible to misunderstand. Steward authority could not be reassigned through administrative promotion. It could not be transferred through executive preference. It could not be altered through occupancy changes or personnel restructuring. The authority belonged solely to the individual designated as system steward. Marcus slowly looked up. "Naomi." Charles nodded once. "Correct." Across the city, Ethan received another message. This one came directly from the Chief Information Officer. "Immediate review recommended. Governance verification sequence tied to legacy stewardship protocols." Ethan read the message twice. Then a third time. His jaw tightened. He immediately called the Chief Information Officer. "I want answers." The executive sounded exhausted. "We are trying to get them." Ethan walked toward the glass windows overlooking Manhattan. "Who activated this?" The answer arrived after a brief silence. "That may not be the right question." Ethan felt irritation rise. "Then what is?" The Chief Information Officer took a slow breath. "The system believes it is protecting itself." For the first time all afternoon, Ethan had no response. Because somewhere beneath the towers, conference rooms, executive titles, and public image he had spent years building, an older structure was waking up. And according to every document now emerging from the shadows, that structure recognized only one steward. At 2:17 p.m., the mood inside Caldwell Dynamics shifted from confusion to concern. Executives who had spent the morning dismissing the verification process as a technical inconvenience were no longer comfortable. Reports continued arriving from across the country. Authorization requests remained pending. Administrative privileges were being restricted. Entire categories of executive access were entering review status without explanation. The company was still operating, but the smooth certainty that normally defined a $12 billion enterprise was beginning to disappear. On the 49th floor, Ethan Caldwell stood inside the executive office staring through the glass toward the Manhattan skyline. The city looked unchanged. Traffic moved below. Helicopters crossed the river. Financial markets continued trading. Yet inside his company, something fundamental was slipping beyond his control. Madison sat nearby reviewing messages that seemed to multiply every few minutes. "Another division just reported access problems," she said. Ethan turned sharply. "How many now?" Madison checked her screen. 32 regional teams. Ethan exhaled slowly. The number was becoming impossible to ignore. Before he could respond, another notification appeared on his phone. "Emergency infrastructure review requested." The message came directly from the board's Technology Oversight Committee. That caught his attention immediately. Board committees did not request emergency reviews unless the situation carried serious implications. Several floors below, the operations center remained calm despite the growing pressure. Engineers moved between workstations while displays tracked verification sequences progressing through multiple enterprise systems. Marcus Reed stood beside the primary monitoring wall studying a new set of diagnostics. The countdown clock now displayed 21 hours and 42 minutes remaining. Another notification appeared. Then another. Across the room, analysts exchanged surprised looks. The architecture was accelerating. Marcus turned toward Naomi. The system completed governance validation. Naomi looked up from the stewardship agreement resting on the conference table, and Marcus handed her the report. It reached a conclusion. Naomi reviewed the document silently. Several pages summarized infrastructure findings, occupancy conflicts, executive credential modifications, and stewardship discrepancies. Near the end appeared a single line highlighted in amber. Steward presence required for executive continuity certification. Marcus watched her carefully. I think it is asking for you. Naomi closed the report. No, she said quietly. It is confirming something it already knows. At 2:39 p.m., Charles Whitmore entered the room carrying another set of documents. He placed them beside Naomi and loosened his tie slightly. Even he appeared impressed by what he was seeing. I just finished reviewing archived governance records, he said. Marcus looked interested. What did you find? Charles opened one document and pointed to a paragraph buried deep within the original stewardship framework. The language had been written nearly 15 years earlier. Infrastructure continuity requires active recognition of designated stewardship authority. Unauthorized displacement may trigger autonomous governance protection measures. Marcus read the passage twice. They actually built this into the company? Charles nodded. They built it into the foundation of the company. Across Manhattan, Ethan was learning the same lesson from a different direction. He sat inside a conference room surrounded by senior executives, legal advisors, and technology leadership. Tension filled the room. The chief information officer projected system reports onto a large display. Every chart pointed toward the same conclusion. The infrastructure itself was enforcing the review process. Can we stop it? Ethan asked. Nobody answered immediately. Finally, the chief information officer spoke. Not directly. Ethan's patience disappeared. There has to be a way. The executive looked uncomfortable. The architecture does not recognize executive override authority during stewardship validation. Silence followed. Several people avoided eye contact. Ethan stared at the display. Who designed that? No one needed to answer. Everyone already knew. Back in the operations center, Naomi stood and walked toward the primary monitoring wall. Hundreds of systems continued communicating across the network. Financial platforms, compliance channels, security frameworks, operational controls. Years of architecture moved before her eyes. Marcus stepped beside her. What happens next? Naomi looked toward the countdown clock. The amber numbers reflected softly across the glass. The company decides whether it still remembers how it was built. As if responding to her words, a new notification appeared at the center of the display. Steward recognition protocol initiated. Around the room, conversations stopped instantly. Engineers looked up. Analysts turned toward the screen. Even Charles remained silent. Because everyone understood one thing at the same moment. The verification process was no longer reviewing the past. It was preparing to make a decision about the future. At 3:11 p.m., the executive floor no longer felt like the center of power. The offices were still immaculate. The skyline still stretched beyond the glass walls in shimmering lines of steel and sunlight. Assistants still moved through corridors carrying tablets and reports. Yet beneath the polished surface, authority was shifting toward places most executives had never seen. Ethan Caldwell felt it with every passing minute. The emergency meeting had ended without answers. Technology leadership could explain what the infrastructure was doing. They could not explain how to stop it. That distinction haunted him. He stood alone inside the executive office, staring at the black display screen mounted behind the desk. It remained inactive despite repeated attempts to restore access. Madison sat nearby, unusually quiet. The confidence that had surrounded her all morning was beginning to fade. For the first time since moving into the office, she looked less like a rising executive and more like someone occupying a space that did not fully accept her presence. Her phone vibrated again. Another event cancellation. Another leadership interview postponed. Another request for clarification regarding governance reviews. She looked toward Ethan. This is getting worse. Ethan did not answer immediately. His attention remained fixed on a document spread across the desk. The original stewardship agreement. Every page seemed to reveal another layer of authority he had never known existed. 15 years of growth. Thousands of employees. Billions in market value. Yet the deeper he read, the clearer one fact became. The foundation beneath it all had not been built around titles. It had been built around trust. Several floors below street level, the operations center remained focused and calm. The primary display wall glowed with streams of data moving through hundreds of enterprise channels. Engineers monitored every stage of the recognition protocol. Marcus Reed stood beside Naomi Carter while the countdown clock continued advancing. 20 hours and 48 minutes remained. Then the room changed. A soft tone echoed across multiple workstations. Analysts looked up simultaneously. New notifications appeared throughout the infrastructure map. One by one, previously restricted systems began completing verification reviews. Amber indicators shifted. Governance pathways updated. Stewardship validation reached its final assessment stage. Marcus studied the incoming reports. It is consolidating. Naomi nodded. She already understood what that meant. The architecture had finished asking questions. Now it was preparing to act. At 3:27 p.m., the board's Technology Oversight Committee received an automated governance summary. Several members opened the report expecting technical updates. Instead, they found a comprehensive review of stewardship authority, infrastructure lineage, executive continuity requirements, and occupancy conflicts. The conclusion occupied only one page. Designated steward confirmed. Executive continuity certification pending recognition. The language was precise. Neutral. Impossible to argue with. Minutes later, Ethan's phone rang. The caller was Richard Holloway. Ethan answered immediately. Richard. The veteran board member sounded calm. Too calm. We received the governance summary. Ethan closed his eyes briefly. And? Richard paused. You should have consulted Naomi before making changes. Ethan looked toward the windows overlooking Manhattan. Nobody knew this existed. Richard's answer arrived without hesitation. She did. The line went silent. Ethan ended the call and remained motionless for several seconds. Outside, sunlight reflected across neighboring towers as the afternoon moved steadily toward evening. The city appeared unchanged. His company did not. At 3:41 p.m., a final notification appeared across the monitoring wall inside the operations center. Conversation stopped instantly. Engineers stood. Analysts turned toward the display. Even Marcus seemed unable to look away. The message occupied the center of the screen in calm white letters. Steward recognition complete. Infrastructure continuity preserved. Beneath it, dozens of systems updated simultaneously. Executive pathways stabilized. Governance reviews concluded. Security architecture returned to normal operation. The building seemed to exhale. Marcus looked toward Naomi. That is it. Naomi studied the display. That is enough. She picked up her portfolio and turned toward the exit. No celebration. No triumph. No dramatic declaration. Because the system had never been built for revenge. It had been built to remember. As she walked through the operations floor, employees stepped aside respectfully. Some finally understood what had happened. Others did not. It no longer mattered. The architecture had made its decision. Upstairs, Ethan remained standing beside the office window when a final document arrived in his inbox. Attached to the governance summary was a single archived record from 15 years earlier. Original system architect, Naomi Carter. Foundational steward, Naomi Carter. Infrastructure authority holder, Naomi Carter. Ethan read the document twice. Then a third time. Beyond the glass, Manhattan stretched endlessly toward the horizon. For years, he believed ownership belonged to the person with the title, the spotlight, and the office. Now he understood something far more expensive. He thought he had given away a room. What he had actually surrendered was recognition of the one person the entire system had been built to trust.